Hello, my name is Myriah Day, and here is my presentation on counseling children with disabilities. This is specifically for the Masters of Education program in school counseling. This assignment is specific to the Counseling 543 course, Counseling Children and Adolescents, during the Summer 1 2021 semester at the University of West Alabama with Dr. Poppy Moon. Before I get started, I just want to share out kind of a couple reasons of why I chose this topic. This topic hits me super close to home as my son has an IEP. He has ADHD, and I feel like learning more and digging deeper and what I can do to support him, but also how I can support my future students with disabilities as a school counselor. So that was the really big hitting close to home and understanding a little bit more in depth about the difference between an IEP and a 504. I was really curious about that. So I'm super excited that I chose this topic because I was able to learn quite a bit about how I can better support children with disabilities. So during this presentation, I am going to share with you a little bit about the history of special education in the United States. I'm also going to be sharing out what the different categories of disabilities are, and it is a pretty extensive list, but I will go as in much detail as I possibly can, but also accommodating for this presentation. And then also the procedures and how things work for IDEA, so the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act, and the Section 504 in schools. Also, I'm not going to go into every counseling strategy for children with disabilities, but I will be giving some brief tips in order to center ourselves as counselors to support children with disabilities. And lastly, how we work with families of children with disabilities. And again, doing the best I can with what I got. So to start out with, we've got the history of special education in the U.S. So before the United States was even established, children with disabilities were considered to be like they are banished, neglected, mistreated, pushed out of society. And this is thinking like before the Christian era. So children with disabilities were just seen as not a member of society, or in some cases not seen to be human. So as Christianity came along, it was Christianity, according to the text from Henderson, the Christianity was viewed them as people that need to be saved or protected or pitied and taken care of. So as the 18th and 19th century realized that these people with disabilities are humans, they found ways that they can have these educational institutions for specifically just for people with disabilities. So they were either institutionalized, like put in a home, or they were put into separate, like this is a certain system for children with disabilities. And then in the 1930s with Franklin Roosevelt, the Crippled Children Act was signed to start giving children some access to education. 1975, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act began and really was starting to take a little bit more into account not only students with physical disabilities, but also mental impairments. So in 1975, that act was then put into our government. And then 1990, this act was renamed. 1990 was renamed the Individuals with Disability Act. So then the 1990 same year, the protections for people with disabilities, and noticing that there became a difference between a 504 plan and then supporting students with disabilities. So I'll get into that a little bit later but 1990, the same kind of idea was the reframing of supporting all students with any kind of impairment. So in 2004, the whole thing was then revamped again and renamed as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act. So kind of thinking a little bit deeper about how we can then give access and the least restrictive environment. And I'll go again into that a little bit deeper in a couple more slides. So that it was revamped again. And then 2009, the right to accommodations regardless of need of education. So that was also additionally in that 504 plan. So getting some rights more for folks in our for our students. So again, that was from Henderson and Thompson. A lot of the history of the special education in the U.S. Moving on, I'm going to get into the categories of the disabilities. So there are many categories, as mentioned before. So the first category is autism. So that is the developmental disability that significantly affects the verbal and nonverbal communication and social interaction. So it's usually evident before age 3, and some common characteristics with people with autism that they have a repetitive behavior or maybe some stereotype movements. But really what I've noticed is that every student that I've worked with that has autism, there is no one way to be autistic. So there are ways to be diagnosed for sure to be autistic, but there is no specific person that is like, this is the way that autism shows up for every student. So, and a lot of things also has to do with sensory. So hearing, smelling, tasting, feeling, lots of textures. Like, again, that's not for every single autistic person will have something to do with auditory or feeling, but that tends to be some of the things that show up for autism. The next one is deaf and blindness. So this would be a combination of hearing and visual impairments. And again, having both of those as a disability can really cause a severe communication and other issues that come along in education. So not being able to read and also not being able to hear creates a very difficult situation for a student to be in a least restrictive environment. So again, I'm going to get into that a little bit. The next one would be deafness, the hearing impairment, so that they are not able to participate in their educational environment. So that would be considered to be a disability. Developmental delay, a delay in one of the areas. So thinking about like what it means to be delayed as far as like physical development, cognitive development, communication, social emotional development, or behavior development. So meaning thinking about if we look at the bell curve of how students develop, if a student is on the low part of the bell curve, like in the 0 to 10%, that would be considered to be a developmental delay. So either not growing as fast or not having the cognition of a student that maybe is considered to be within the other part of the bell curve, like the norm or the outside of the norm. So that would be the developmental delay. Again, this is from Henderson and Thompson. So I've got quite a few. I've got about fourth the way through. Still have a couple more to share with you. So here we have emotional disturbance. Emotional disturbance, there's a lot involved in the emotional disturbance. So this can be any of these things. So the inability to learn that can't be explained through that intellectual sensory or health factors. Sometimes it really has to do with the way that they maintain interpersonal relationships or the way that they interact with others. That can also be a student that maybe has some severe depression or extremely unhappy. And sometimes these do often develop into physical symptoms and fears. So emotional disturbance is what's that would be. This one's a little bit more detailed, but as we get into the sixth one, hearing impaired. So that is an impairment of hearing. That is not necessarily deafness, but that is gonna be where maybe a student can use a hearing aid in order to support them to hear better in the classroom. So intellectual disability. So that's thinking again back to that bell curve, thinking about the functioning of the not being able to process or I'm gonna look at my notes really quick. Excuse me. So as we look at how students learn on what is considered to be the norm, that they are the intellectual disability is not necessarily is going to really adversely affect the children's educational performance. Then we have multiple disabilities. So that's when there's a lot of overlapping disabilities at once. So that would obviously also be one of the categories of a disability. So that sometimes students that have multiple disabilities that are impairing their impact to learn, they maybe not necessarily in very many general education classes. So then another category of disability is orthopedic impairment. So thinking about a student that might have um, an anomaly that is that is because of a disease like polio or tuberculosis, or other causes from cerebral palsy, or maybe they have an amputation or any of those things. So orthopedic impairment would be another one. Other health impairment, so it means having the limiting strength, vitality, or alertness, including like if there's a heightened alertness to stimuli. So this is, for example, what I mentioned. My son has other health impairment as one of his is recognized as a disability. So this can be things like having ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and or asthma or epilepsy, excuse me, lead poisoning, Tourette syndrome, so other health impairment, things that are going to either be heightened alertness to the environment, so things that are going to be affected by the educational environment. And then we have our last couple here. Oh, I have that on there twice. Then we have specific learning disability. So this is one or more of the psychological processes that is in understanding or using the language that has to do with listening, thinking, speaking, reading, writing, spelling, or math. So specific, like being able to process things. Maybe that means that a student might process more slowly, or they might process in a way that includes having to have certain access to resources. So then we have speech and language impairment. That is, if there's a communication disorder, if they're stuttering or impaired, if the student's not able to fully articulate their words, or if they have an impairment about their voice. Number 13 is a traumatic brain injury. As you might notice, this is all in alphabetical order, but traumatic brain injury and autism were added to the categories of specific disabilities a lot later under the IDEA Act. Traumatic brain injury could be caused by some kind of physical force, that maybe a student had some kind of injury from falling, or being like having something dropped on them, or any of those. Or I know that there's more students that are playing football that are experiencing a traumatic brain injury. And our last category of disabilities is a visual impairment, including blindness. So that impairment can mean that there is maybe a correction, or that the student is then considered to be blind under the National Decimation Center for Children with Disabilities. So that, again, each of these would certainly affect a student in the educational environment. And lastly, all of this is from Henderson and Thompson. All right. So as we get a little bit deeper into understanding what the procedures for IDEA, so this is, again, for the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act. So there are four main parts. So if you see here right above my head here, there is a little graphic that I have here. So these are not the four parts, but this is a way to kind of break down how each of these things. So we have all the students within the district would be at the outside. Then we have students that have some impairments. Then we have students that have impairments that substantially limit their ability to access the content or the material learned in school. And then ideas for students that have more severe impairments. So under IDEA, there are four main parts. the part A is basically kind of getting into digging into the foundation of the act. This is allowing for that each child with a disability has has the right to free and appropriate public education, also with the acronym FAPE. Um, Also goes through what it means to have a individualized education program, so the IEP, and any of these things that are like just kind of getting into the basics information about the act. Part B is about the funding, and this is really laid out within a lot more detail that the funding that the federal government offers to the states in special education for children with disabilities. So under under the FAPE, that states must provide the free and appropriate public education with children with disabilities starting at age 23 and all the way up until age 22. They need to be accessing the services for free. That means they don't need to pay for another teacher. The student themselves and the families, they need to have all of the resources provided to them by the school. So I know that in the district that I work, I think that it's an additional $3,000 per year per student with the IEP. So that means that certain staff can be hired to support those students. And again, this is provided by the federal government to states for special education. And then within the IDEA Act, every eligible student must receive an IEP, and it must be developed by the IEP team, and then so that the special education is provided to meet the needs of this. So that plan has to be implemented for every single student. And that's also within that funding component from Part B. This is a little bit more. Part C is a part that IDEA recognizes the need in identifying and reaching infants and toddlers with disabilities. So it's really important. So that outreach part of catching students that have disabilities and making sure that those things are recognized at an early age. So that's a little bit shorter part. And then Part D is the grants that can also applied to in order to make sure that there is personal development, that there's actually results that are improving for children, and that projects are implemented, and that there's also technologies that are being used either through occupational therapists, or maybe there's technologies that students are able to use in the classroom, and that those technologies are then provided for students in order to access education. So that's kind of the nitty gritty about IDEA. As we get into Section 504, Section 504 is, sorry, I have one more thing about the IDEA. I thought that I was jumping. I got a little ahead of myself. Is the 6 main principles. This is one thing that I think that it was really important to mention, even though I have each of the parts of IDEA. The 6 main principles of the IDEA are that you have, again, that FAPE, that free and appropriate public education. Absolutely, that's really important, that every student has access regardless of their income. Second one is appropriate evaluation, that there is a thorough evaluation of the process to support the student that has an IEP, which gets into the next one, that every student has an individual education program. The least restrictive environment is also super, super important, that we do not have exclusionary principles that limits the student to be isolated by themselves, or not by themselves, but within thinking back to the 18th and 19th century type of we're going to separate them from the general education. That is not what is meant to be. What is really meant to be is that every general education classroom needs to have the least restrictive environment. So whether that means if a student has a disability that limits their access to the education, and they are not triggered by being in a classroom with several students, they need to be there. I had a student that had a paraeducator, and he had a severe fear. He had autism, or he has autism. He's still he's graduated now, but he had a paraeducator with him for every class because he had a severe fear of lightning. So anytime that there was any kind of storm or any kind of rain, he had some stuff that he needed to work out, and he was in my classroom, and he was in the least restrictive environment, and his parents really advocated that he was not put into a classroom where he didn't have access to his education. And that leads me into the next one, is that parents are really in the full participation in the decision making. It's not, and also the student. I would want to add that in there as, as my own. I think it's really important to include students and parents' full participation in decision making. And then the last one is that there is procedural safeguards, meaning that there are like procedures that are actually there's continuous communication with the parents, there's continuous communication with the teachers, there's reviews, there's not just like writing an IEP and saying that's good to go. It means that you're going to do an IEP and then do certain check-ins points throughout the year, certain check-in points throughout the education of the student. So we don't just, because we all evolve. So really important to know that just because a student is having a certain disability right now doesn't mean that it's not going to evolve or change over time. So for not meaning go away, but like how things continue to evolve. So that's a little bit about IDEA. And now I go into 504. So 504 is, again, is more under the idea that there are students that are going to have a physical or a mental impairment that is going to limit one or more of their major life activities. So as far as like the difference between a 504 and an IEP, the main things are that a 504 is going to support a student that might need somewhat is an accommodation to access the environment, that their learning environment. So the three questions that are really important to ask when developing a 504 is that, does the student have a physical or mental impairment? If the student does, you say that, what do the activities claimed to be impaired qualify as a major life activity? And yes, school is a major life activity. And then from there, does the physical or mental impairment substantially limit one or more of these activities? So if any of these questions really are yes, you do need to consider how 504 can be used to support the student. So in the article by Pullman, Schwab, Moses, and Gilchrist and Schwab, there's two Schwabs on that one. So sorry about that. The section 504 is really like for students that might have a temporary injury. Maybe they've broken their leg and they need a 504 to allow them for extra time to get between classes. Or maybe they have a severe allergy that is not going to affect their ability to access education, but they might have a situation where people need to be informed about in the classroom if there's like a peanut allergy or something, or allergy to latex, or any of those things, thinking about like in a chemistry room wearing gloves or any of that. Anxiety can be one of the things. Like one of my students currently has a 504 plan for her anxiety in order to support her to access the content. That means that she gets video lessons so she can also participate in the education, and that means that she can have extended time if needed. But with those supports, she's able to access her education. So 504s are, again, for students that have impairments, but maybe in some regards less severe than students that have a IEP. So as far as counseling strategies for children with disabilities, there are so many strategies. I probably couldn't list them in this entire presentation, but the main thing, the very first thing that every school counselor has to do before they develop the strategy to work with children with disabilities is to check themselves. They need to look at themselves and see, do they have any biases before working with children with disabilities? If they do, they either need to process those biases, or they need to figure out a plan in order to really dismantle their own biases of children with working with children with disabilities. They also need to educate themselves. Just because you've worked with one autistic student, they're thinking about that, what I mentioned earlier, just because you've worked with one autistic student doesn't mean you get to apply the same strategies that you did with the other autistic student. So you need to know the student, you need to know the family. We need to be able to connect to one another as a counseling department, as a counseling association, to educate ourselves about how to best find the right strategies to work with certain students. And again, I mentioned that is educate themselves, but knowing the child. You cannot just think that you can jump right in with all of these strategies without having a connection to doing either some research of what has worked for the child and doing some things that you that have been researched to work. You don't just like put a student in the middle of the room and say, okay, now you do this. So there's some things that you need to do in order to find find strategies that work for kids. And also being able to connect to the community and services. And that means also kind of, again, a bit about that second bullet point, connecting to the community, connecting to the services, connecting the parents and to the teachers and to the outside services. If a student has, I'm thinking coming back to if the student has Tourette's syndrome, being able to know the services that provide for students that have Tourette's, or for students that have a traumatic brain injury, being able to connect students to the services that are beyond your framework. So that's super important in order to find those counseling strategies. So this is from Tarver, Bering, and Spagna. So that's as far as I'm going to go with the strategies, because there are so many strategies. There's person-centered, there's solutions-focused brief counseling, or brief solutions-focused counseling. There's many different types of things that we could do in order to support our students with disabilities. But we just really need to make sure that we have that they are allowed to be in an environment that not only being allowed, but really being welcomed in an environment where they are accepted and loved and cared for and known a valid part of our community. As far as working with families and children with disabilities, there are many, many things. There's all the minutia of outreach and all the other things that are involved with working with families with disabilities that can go along with home visits and meetings and all of those things. But really, they're kind of digging into the things is being able to encourage the parents to learn things also on their own. It is, yes, your job to support them, but to think about how exceptional the child is and what the student's strengths are and what the student's limitations are. So encouraging the parents to really find providing some resources, but allowing the parents to learn about their student with a disability, and also allowing the parent to feel their feelings. So sometimes parents have high expectations that their child is going to fit within this norm, but allowing them to feel their feelings, because that also allows them to be heard, but also not put the burden on their child. So that we don't want to inhibit the child's progress, because again, our jobs are to support the children with a disability, but also allow the parent to feel their feelings without harming their child. So again, not only are you offering resources to students, but you're also offering parents and families those state resources, those district resources, all of the things that can be not only for education, but also for medical and emotional and sometimes also financial resources. So being able to offer parents resources and knowing those resources. And then also thinking that, if a parent comes thinking that their student with a disability has to have straight A's in order to be successful in the world, being able to really allow them to set realistic expectations of the child, and knowing that straight A's, it doesn't mean that you're going to be a great person in society. And so there's like that fine balance of like allowing parents to feel their feelings, but also having realistic expectations of their child. And then also to think of them to like that you are continuing to be, or we are continuing to be, an advocate for the student and what the student needs and what the student wants, and that the student has rights, and that is up to the student on what they want to do with their life, not up to what the parent wants to do with their lives. So that's going to be super essential as we continue to support our students with disabilities. And here are all of my references. And lastly, I'd like to thank you for watching. Thank you.